Some conversations start with curiosity, others start with a line so overused it barely counts as a thought anymore. And that's where this whole tier list comes in. When someone throws out a claim that's been passed around for decades without anyone stopping to check whether it's even true, it reveals something deeper than just a bad argument. It shows how much we rely on habits of belief rather than clear thinking. And when these lines get aimed at people who already spend a lot of time questioning ideas, the gaps become hard to ignore. The first one usually lands with a confident smile. You just hate God, it's said, as if it settles everything, as if disagreement can only come from emotion rather than evidence. But the strange thing is this: you can't hate something you don't think actually exists. Nobody wakes up furious at unicorns. Yet this line gets repeated because it shifts the burden away from understanding the argument and puts it on the person raising the objection. It's a psychological shield, a way to turn a discussion about ideas into a diagnosis of motives. And once that happens, the conversation stops being about truth and starts being about defending identity. When you take a step back, it becomes clear why this line shows up so often. Many people grow up hearing that faith and moral character are linked so tightly that doubting one means breaking the other. So the assumption quietly takes root that disagreement is rebellion, or resentment, or disappointment. But the real world doesn't work that cleanly. People question beliefs for reasons as varied as their own lives: history, science, philosophy, lived experience, and none of that requires anger towards something supernatural. It only requires curiosity and a willingness to examine claims instead of accepting them by default. Another classic usually follows right after. You just want to live without rules. It's presented like a checkmate, as if the only thing stopping someone from committing every crime imaginable is a verse written several thousand years ago. The irony is that the world doesn't reflect that idea at all. Countries with lower levels of religious belief tend to have lower crime rates, lower levels of corruption, higher levels of social trust. And that's not because people lack structure. It's because structure can come from empathy, cooperation, and shared systems that don't rely on supernatural reward or punishment. Morality works best when it grows from understanding rather than fear. This line also hides a quiet insult: the assumption that without a divine command, a person wouldn't know right from wrong. But even children who've never heard of theology understand fairness, understand harm, understand kindness. The roots of morality are older than any religious text. They're built into how humans function in groups, how we survive, how we protect our young, how we avoid pain and seek connection. The rules came long before the stories that tried to explain them. Then there's the one that gets repeated like it's the most airtight logic ever written. There are no atheists in foxholes. The reality is full of documented cases of people in war, disaster, and crisis who held on to non-belief even when facing the worst situations imaginable. But the phrase survives because it paints a comforting picture that deep down, everyone ultimately agrees with the believer's worldview. They just need enough fear to reveal it. The problem is that fear doesn't magically create belief. It only creates desperation, and desperation can make people say or hope for almost anything. But that doesn't make it true. Real conviction isn't something that suddenly appears under the threat of death. It's something built from years of thought, reflection, and sometimes even discomfort. The deeper issue behind this line is that it treats belief as a default state, something everyone secretly holds but some refuse to admit. But when you look at human cultures across history, beliefs change dramatically based on geography, language, and time period. If belief were a universal instinct, we'd all end up with the same conclusions no matter where we were born. Yet that's never been the case. What people believe tends to reflect the stories they were surrounded with, not a universal truth rising up from inside them. One more line deserves an early spot on the tier list, because it tries to flip the conversation in a surprisingly clever way. You have faith too. Science is just your religion. This argument shows up when someone doesn't really understand how science works, or maybe they do, but the comparison feels useful. The idea is that if both science and religion require faith, then they're equally uncertain, equally speculative, equally based on trust. But the kind of trust involved is entirely different. Scientific trust is provisional. It changes with new data, it adapts, it updates. Religious faith is fixed. It commits first and asks questions afterward, if at all. To see the difference, you only have to watch what happens when evidence contradicts a belief. In science, contradiction is a sign to revise the theory. In religion, it's often a sign to reinterpret, defend, or ignore the evidence. These two processes don't operate the same way, and pretending they do is like saying a seatbelt and a superstition are both forms of safety because they make someone feel better. One is testable, the other isn't, and this is only the beginning. The more you go through these lines, the more you start to see patterns, shifts in logic, emotional fallbacks, assumptions carried over from childhood stories, and a handful of arguments that sound powerful until you look even slightly closer. Each one reveals something about how ideas spread, how identity shapes belief, and how difficult it is to let go of something that once felt like truth. Another line that tends to appear when someone feels the ground shifting under them is this one: life can't have meaning without God. It's spoken with certainty, as if the universe handed out a manual and only one worldview kept the correct copy. But meaning has never been something delivered from outside. It's something people build through relationships, work, curiosity, creativity, community, and the experiences that shape them over time. When someone argues that meaning must come from a divine source, they're really expressing a fear that meaning which isn't pre-assigned might not feel as stable. The strange part is that most of the things people genuinely find meaningful have nothing to do with the supernatural. The joy of raising a child, the pride of mastering a skill, the satisfaction of helping someone without expecting anything in return. None of that requires belief in a cosmic plan. Those experiences matter because they matter to us, because they're connected to how our brains interpret value and connection. A universe without divine authorship doesn't erase meaning. It forces us to be active participants instead of passive recipients. And for many people, that makes meaning feel deeper, not shallower. Then comes a line that sounds scientific on the surface, but collapses the moment you dig into it. Everything must have a creator. This argument tries to treat the universe like an object in a workshop, waiting for a craftsman to show up with tools and blueprints. But the logic breaks immediately, because if everything needs a creator, then so would the creator, which believers quickly say is unnecessary. Once the rule gets broken once, the argument loses all force. It becomes a rule applied selectively, not universally. What's often missed is that the universe doesn't behave like everyday objects. The origins of space, time, and energy aren't comparable to building a table or designing a painting. Physics is full of strange, counterintuitive concepts: quantum fluctuations, emergent properties, vacuum instability, symmetry breaking, things that don't map neatly onto human intuitions. And when someone insists the universe must follow familiar patterns, they're really just projecting their everyday experiences onto something far more complex. It's like assuming the weather should follow the rules of a board game because both involve patterns. Another common line that earns a solid spot in the mid-tier is this: you can't prove God doesn't exist. The problem is that this flips the burden of proof upside down. If someone claims there's an invisible dragon living in their garage, you wouldn't need to disprove it. The person making the claim would need to show something measurable, testable, or observable. Otherwise, every idea becomes equally believable simply because it can't be disproven. And once that door opens, logic shuts down. You could propose 1,000 supernatural beings, each with different rules and stories, and they'd all become equally plausible simply because they can't be disproven. What makes this line especially telling is that it avoids evidence entirely. Instead of offering reasons for belief, it tries to paralyze skepticism by suggesting that uncertainty means all claims are equally valid. But uncertainty isn't a vacuum. It's an invitation to evaluate what best fits the data we actually have. And the data we have about the universe, from biology to cosmology to geology, doesn't require a supernatural layer to make sense. If anything, the more we learn, the smaller the gaps become where such explanations once lived. A close relative of this line is another favorite: it takes more faith to not believe. This one tries to treat a lack of belief as a leap of commitment, as if withholding acceptance until evidence arrives is somehow a stronger stance than believing without it. But withholding belief isn't a leap, it's the absence of one. If someone tells you a lottery ticket is guaranteed to win, refusing to buy it doesn't require faith. It requires caution. And when someone claims the entire universe is run by a specific supernatural intelligence, asking for evidence isn't a sign of faith, it's a sign of not wanting to base a worldview on hope alone. Behind this argument is a deeper insecurity: the idea that if two people disagree, they must be taking equally uncertain risks. But the risk isn't symmetrical. Belief asks you to commit to a set of claims, doctrines, and narratives that expect acceptance before verification. Non-belief asks you to hold off until something verifiable appears. One position locks you into conclusions. The other allows for updates whenever new information arrives. That's not a matter of faith. That's a matter of intellectual breathing room. Then we get to a line that often appears when someone feels like they're losing ground in the logical part of the conversation: you're overthinking it. This is usually delivered with a kind smile, as if deep analysis were a personal flaw rather than a basic tool for navigating the world. But the moment someone discourages thinking, the structure holding up their claim becomes suspicious. Ideas that fall apart under scrutiny don't become stronger when protected from scrutiny. This line serves as a kind of emergency brake, a way to retreat when the conversation starts drifting into uncomfortable territory. It turns critical thought into a liability, not an asset. But the questions people ask about religion, historical accuracy, contradictions, psychological origins, sociological impact, aren't overthinking. They're the exact kind of questions we ask about anything important: medicine, law, technology, ethics. Nobody calls it overthinking when someone wants evidence before undergoing a surgery or signing a contract. One more line that hovers around the same tier is this: you'll believe when something bad happens to you. It's a quiet threat disguised as a prediction, suggesting that personal suffering will eventually force acceptance. But suffering doesn't create truth. It only creates vulnerability. People going through pain don't suddenly gain access to deeper cosmic knowledge. They're just more likely to search for comfort anywhere they can find it. And while there's nothing wrong with seeking comfort, it doesn't turn emotional needs into evidence. What this line reveals is the assumption that belief is the natural destination and doubt is just a detour. But for many people, difficult experiences do the opposite. They lead to harder questions, deeper skepticism, and a clearer understanding of how unpredictable life really is. Pain doesn't always push people toward belief. Sometimes it pushes them toward clarity. More lines fill the tier list, each revealing something unique about how people try to protect the ideas they were taught to hold above question. We'll get to those: the high tier, the low tier, the barely even an argument tier. And each one opens a window into why these conversations play out the way they do. Another line that always seems to rise into the conversation sooner or later is this one: you're only skeptical because you had bad experiences with religion. It tries to turn a thoughtful position into a personal wound, as if questioning claims requires some emotional trauma rather than straightforward reasoning. The implication is subtle. If someone doubts, it must be because something hurt them, not because the evidence doesn't hold up. But skepticism isn't a psychological scar. It's a method. People question ideas in every area of life: politics, medicine, history, economics, and nobody assumes they were traumatized by a textbook simply because they want accurate information. What makes this line especially revealing is that it quietly avoids the central issue, the content of the belief itself. Instead of addressing historical claims, textual contradictions, moral dilemmas, or scientific conflicts, it reframes the skeptic as someone acting from emotion rather than reason. This is a protective reflex, not an argument. It's much easier to explain disagreement by pathologizing the other person than by re-examining the foundation of your own worldview. Then we have a line that tries to draw moral authority from assumed wisdom. Deep down, you know God is real. It's said with absolute confidence, as if someone else has access to your internal thoughts. The strange thing is that this line almost never comes from evidence or reasoning. It comes from the speaker's worldview. A worldview where everyone secretly agrees, but some are suppressing the truth. This creates a closed system. Any denial becomes further proof of resistance, not proof of genuine difference. But internal conviction can't be assumed. People disagree on thousands of things: worldviews, philosophies, metaphysics, and nobody suggests that everyone deep down believes in the same political ideology or the same economic theory. Belief isn't universal. It's shaped by culture, upbringing, exposure to information, and personal reflection. If everyone deep down believed the same thing, the world wouldn't have thousands of belief systems. The diversity alone is enough to show how implausible that assumption is. Another line that belongs firmly in the mid-low tier for lack of substance is, "But what if you're wrong?" It's meant to introduce fear into the conversation, the possibility of eternal consequences. This is the foundation of Pascal's wager, though most people don't name it. The idea is simple: belief is a safe bet, and non-belief is a dangerous gamble. But that logic only works if there's exactly one possible belief system. The moment you acknowledge the thousands of religions humans have created, the wager collapses. If someone chooses the wrong belief, the same consequences would apply. There's no safety in belief, only the illusion of it. This argument also mistakes fear for evidence. You can't determine the truth of a claim based on how scary the alternative sounds. If fear were a reliable path to truth, every superstition in history would be valid simply because someone found it frightening. Truth doesn't emerge from threats. It emerges from evidence, consistency, and coherence with reality. Moving further down the tier list, we reach a line that sounds humble but functions as an escape hatch. Human minds can't understand God's ways. This statement gets used the moment a contradiction becomes too obvious to ignore. When a moral claim doesn't make sense, when a story conflicts with known history, when divine behavior seems inconsistent, the answer becomes, it's beyond human understanding. The problem with this line is that it invalidates all attempts at reasoning. If no contradiction can ever count as a contradiction because the explanation is unknowable, then no amount of logic or evidence matters. This is the kind of argument that can protect any idea, no matter how inconsistent. If every difficult question can be waved away by calling it mysterious, then the belief becomes immune to analysis. But immunity isn't strength, it's fragility. Ideas that rely on mystery to survive can't stand on their own. And if the human mind is incapable of understanding the divine, then every claim about the divine, including the believer's own, becomes equally unreliable. Next comes a line that feels reasonable at first but falls apart quickly. Billions of people believe, so they can't all be wrong. The number of people who believe something doesn't affect whether it's true. People once believed the earth was the center of the universe. People believed diseases were caused by demons. People believed the sun revolved around us. Popularity has never been a measure of accuracy. If anything, it shows how easily ideas spread when they're attached to tradition and identity. This argument also ignores the obvious. Billions of people disagree with each other. If Christianity were validated by large numbers, then so would Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and every major tradition. The moment you apply the logic consistently, it cancels itself out. Another line that tends to appear when someone feels cornered is, well, you just have to have an open mind. This line gets used when the evidence for a claim is weak or non-existent. But an open mind doesn't mean accepting anything without justification. It means being willing to update your view when new evidence appears. If someone asks for evidence and none is offered, the issue isn't closed-mindedness, it's intellectual responsibility. Being open-minded doesn't require believing every extraordinary claim any more than being health-conscious requires eating every wild berry you find in the forest. One of the most emotionally charged lines on the list is, "You're ruining other people's faith." It's not really an argument about truth, it's about the social role of belief. Faith can be a coping mechanism, a source of identity, or a stabilizing force for communities. When someone questions it, the pushback isn't always about the idea itself. It's about the fear that uncertainty will spread. This line expresses that fear. It tries to imply that raising valid questions is harmful, even irresponsible. But ideas survive or collapse based on how well they match reality, not based on how carefully people avoid discussing them. If a belief can be ruined by questions, that says something about its strength. Honest conversation isn't dangerous, it's necessary, and protecting people from questions only delays the moment when they eventually face them on their own. More lines fill out the list. Some confident, some defensive, some meant to comfort, others meant to intimidate. Each one adds another layer to the story of why these conversations unfold the way they do. One line that always earns a place in the lower tiers, not because it's rude, but because it's so disconnected from how evidence works, is this one. Look at the trees. Sometimes it's look at the sunset, or look at the human eye, or look at how beautiful everything is. It's an argument from awe, a feeling turned into a conclusion. And while awe is a powerful emotion, emotions don't determine the truth of a claim. Beauty doesn't prove design any more than fear proves danger or hope proves safety. The natural world is breathtaking, but that doesn't point to a supernatural architect. It points to the human brain's ability to find patterns, symmetry, and meaning in the environment. What's interesting is that this argument only feels persuasive when someone hasn't studied the natural processes behind what they're observing. Trees grow because of cellular replication, sunlight, water, and evolution. Eyes form through millions of tiny mutations over vast stretches of time, each one offering a slight survival advantage. Sunsets are caused by atmospheric scattering. The beauty is still there, but understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish it. In fact, many people find that understanding makes the beauty deeper, not shallower. Another line that hovers around the same level is, science changes all the time, but the truth of the Bible never changes. This statement treats change as a flaw rather than a strength. Scientific knowledge updates because it follows evidence wherever it leads. When new data comes in, conclusions shift. That's how progress works. If medicine never changed, we'd still be using leeches as the default treatment for illness. If astronomy never changed, we'd still think stars were tiny lights held in place by a crystal dome. Change isn't instability, it's refinement. In contrast, a belief system that never changes isn't demonstrating truth, it's demonstrating the inability to adapt. When a worldview stays static while the world around it evolves, it stops being a reflection of reality and becomes a relic of history. The world doesn't stay the same. Our understanding of it shouldn't either. Then we reach a line that tries to flip uncertainty into an explanation. Everything happens for a reason. It's comforting, yes, but comfort doesn't make a statement true. This line flattens the complexity of life, reducing randomness, chance, natural processes, and human decisions into a single sweeping claim. It suggests that every tragedy, every accident, every illness, every loss, every disaster was guided by invisible intention. And that's a heavy claim. If every event has divine purpose, then so does every form of suffering. That idea raises more problems than it solves. People use this line because uncertainty is frightening. Randomness can feel unfair. chaotic, even cruel. But randomness is part of the structure of the universe, from quantum fluctuations to genetic mutations to weather patterns. Accepting that things don't always have hidden purpose doesn't make life meaningless. It makes responsibility real. It means our choices matter because they aren't overshadowed by cosmic plans we can't see. Mid-tier arguments often come in the form of personal testimonies. I feel God in my heart, or I had an experience you can't explain. Personal experience is powerful, but it isn't a reliable path to universal truth. People all over the world have life-changing spiritual experiences. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and people with no religious identity at all. These experiences typically reflect the person's cultural background, expectations, and emotional state. They rarely, if ever, point to information outside what the person already believes. Neurology shows how easily powerful feelings can be triggered by stress, ritual, music, community, memory, or even mild oxygen deprivation. The brain can create profound sensations, presence, peace, fear, connection, without any external supernatural cause. Experiences are real. The interpretations are where things diverge. One of the most revealing lines is, "You're taking things too literally." This gets used whenever someone points out contradictions in scripture or problematic passages. It's a flexible defense. Every uncomfortable verse becomes metaphorical, while every convenient one stays literal. The rules shift depending on what needs to be protected in the moment. But if the line between metaphor and history changes based on convenience, the text loses objective meaning. It becomes a mirror reflecting whatever the reader wants to see. This reveals something deeper about how belief often functions. Instead of interpreting the text and then forming a worldview, many people form a worldview first and then reinterpret the text to match it. This is reverse reasoning. Conclusions first, justifications second. And while that process is human and understandable, it doesn't lead to reliable truth. Another low-tier argument often appears when someone wants to end the conversation without admitting that they're ending it. "You'll understand when you're older." It's dismissive, and it tries to turn disagreement into immaturity. But age doesn't automatically lead to any specific belief. There are older believers, older skeptics, older mystics, older scientists. People of every age fall across every worldview. Maturity doesn't push people toward a single conclusion. It pushes them toward clearer thinking, whatever direction that may lead. One more line that belongs near the bottom of the tier list is, "If you don't believe, why talk about it at all?" It sounds logical at first, but it misunderstands the purpose of discussion. People talk about ideas because ideas shape societies, shape laws, shape education, shape morality, shape how communities function. You don't need to believe in something to recognize its impact. People debate politics they don't support, philosophies they don't follow, and historical claims they don't accept. Discussion isn't a sign of belief, it's a sign of engagement with reality. This line also assumes that beliefs are private, harmless, and detached from the world. But beliefs don't stay in people's heads. They influence what gets taught in schools, what rights people have, how governments make decisions, and how communities treat one another. Discussing these ideas isn't hostility. It's necessary for any society that wants to understand itself. And still, the tier list grows. Some lines are confident, some defensive, some meant to comfort, some meant to warn, but each one reveals something about the way belief protects itself, adapts to pressure, and resists questions that run too deep. The more you analyze them, the clearer the underlying patterns become. Another line that sits firmly in the mid-low tier for how often it's used and how little it actually says is, "Morality comes from God, so without God, you can't know right from wrong." It sounds authoritative, but it collapses as soon as you look at how humans actually behave. Moral instincts appear long before religious instruction, in toddlers who comfort others when they cry, in children who understand fairness even without being taught, in communities that existed thousands of years before organized religion and still formed moral codes about cooperation, honesty, and harm. Morality isn't handed down. It emerges from social creatures learning how to live together. If morality came exclusively from one divine source, we'd expect religious communities to have identical moral codes. But even within a single tradition, believers disagree on nearly everything: war, punishment, sexuality, gender roles, wealth, charity, medical ethics. The moment someone claims morality is fixed and simple, real-world data pushes back. Human moral systems evolve as societies grow, as empathy expands, as knowledge deepens. That evolution makes sense if morality is a human construction, but makes far less sense if it's supposedly fixed by something unchanging. Then comes the closely related line, "Without God, anything is allowed." It's an argument from fear rather than reason. People don't suddenly lose empathy or compassion when they step away from a belief system. Most people don't help others because they're afraid of punishment or hoping for reward. They help because empathy is a built-in part of the human brain. because cooperation has evolutionary advantages, because compassion feels meaningful. If the only thing stopping someone from causing harm is fear of divine consequences, that's not morality, that's obedience. True morality comes from considering the well-being of others, not from avoiding supernatural penalties. Another argument that often shows up when someone feels their worldview is being threatened is, "You're just afraid God might be real." This is a projection, an attempt to flip the emotional tension onto the other person. But fear isn't the driving force behind doubt. People don't question claims because they're afraid the claims might be true. They question them because the evidence doesn't hold up. And ironically, fear is far more often used as a motivator for belief. Fear of punishment, fear of judgment, fear of eternity, fear of meaninglessness. When someone projects that fear onto others, they're revealing what drives them, not what drives the person they're speaking to. Then we reach a line that tries to pull authority from ancient origins. People have believed this for thousands of years. The age of an idea doesn't tell us anything about its accuracy. People believed the earth was flat for most of human history. People believed illness was caused by curses. People believed kings ruled by divine right. Tradition can preserve wisdom, but it can also preserve mistakes. When someone leans on history to defend a belief, they're relying on accumulated repetition, not evidence. Ideas survive because they're passed down, not because they reflect reality. Another line that gets tossed out when the conversation starts leaning toward evidence is, faith is a virtue. It's stated as if believing without evidence is inherently admirable. But if that principle were applied universally, every belief would be equally valid. Contradictory religions, incompatible doctrines, mutually exclusive worldviews. Elevating belief without evidence as a virtue means abandoning any method for distinguishing truth from wishful thinking. At that point, the discussion stops being about what's true and becomes about what feels comforting. One of the most circular lines on the list is, "The Bible is true because it says it's true." This argument shows up more often than people admit. A book claiming its own accuracy doesn't prove anything. Otherwise, every novel, every myth, every religious text would be self-verified. If self-validation were acceptable evidence, reality would be whatever claims to describe it. Accuracy requires external confirmation. Archaeology, history, consistency, testable predictions, not repeated assertions within the same closed system. A related line that appears when someone tries to bridge multiple contradictions at once is, "You're taking it out of context." Sometimes this is valid, context does matter, but the problem is that this line gets used even when the context strengthens the contradiction instead of resolving it. It becomes a reflex, a shield dropped whenever a passage is uncomfortable. If every troubling verse is out of context, then context becomes meaningless. The text becomes endlessly flexible, reshaped automatically to avoid conflict with modern morality or modern knowledge. Then there's the line, "God works through mysterious ways." It's essentially a conversational dead end. It appears when someone runs out of explanations but doesn't want to acknowledge the gap. The word mysterious covers everything: contradictions, suffering, injustice, unanswered prayers, scientific conflicts, but calling something mysterious isn't the same as explaining it. It just places a curtain over the unknown and treats the curtain as the answer. This argument also creates a double standard. Successes are credited to divine action, while failures are excused by mystery. If someone survives an accident, it's a miracle, but if someone doesn't, it's mysterious. If a prayer appears to be answered, it's divine intervention, but if it isn't, it's unknowable. A worldview that's unfalsifiable doesn't tell us anything about reality. It only protects itself from scrutiny. Another line that appears surprisingly often is, "You'll regret this when you're older." It's a prediction disguised as wisdom, meant to introduce doubt through authority rather than reasoning. But people don't universally converge on religious belief as they age. Some do, some don't. Many move away from it as they learn more about the world, as their experiences broaden, or as their values shift. Age brings perspective, but not one predetermined conclusion. Life is too complex for that. A more defensive line is, "You're attacking my identity." This usually happens when someone interprets questions as personal criticism. But questioning an idea isn't the same as judging a person. Ideas should be able to withstand examination. If an idea feels so intertwined with identity that examining it feels like harm, that's not evidence of the idea's truth. That's evidence of how deeply it was woven into the person's sense of self. And still, the tier list stretches further. Some arguments are well-intentioned but misguided. Others are built on misunderstanding. Some are emotional reactions. Some are attempts to escape cognitive dissonance. But each one sheds a little more light on how belief systems defend themselves, how conversations spiral, and how people protect the frameworks they were raised with. And that's the moment when you start noticing a pattern. The moment when you realize these conversations almost never come from a place of curiosity, but from a place of defending a conclusion that was chosen long before the conversation even began. People will frame their question like they're inviting a discussion, but underneath it, they're quietly bracing themselves, hoping you won't say anything that shakes a belief they've built their life around. So when you respond with something simple and clear, something grounded in basic logic, they sometimes freeze for a second. You can almost see the gears turning, and then they reach for the next argument on the shelf, even if it contradicts the one they used 5 minutes earlier. And that's where the tier list starts to get interesting, because this next category is full of arguments that sound confident on the surface, but unravel the moment they're examined with even the slightest bit of consistency. One that shows up a lot is when someone says that life has no value without their belief system. They'll claim that meaning is impossible without a divine source, even though meaning is something humans create through relationships, goals, creativity, curiosity, and the simple desire to make life better for the people we care about. Meaning is not something that has to be handed down from above. It grows from the inside, shaped by experience and connection. But instead of exploring that, they'll insist that without an external authority, everything collapses, as if morality only works when someone is watching from the sky. They don't seem to realize that the most reliable moral progress in human history has come from people pushing back against authority, not surrendering to it. And this next argument always shows up right after that one. It's the claim that objective morality couldn't exist without their version of God. But when you ask them to define objective morality, the explanation becomes vague within seconds. They'll say it's a code that must be universal, binding, and independent of human opinion. But then they reference a text full of rules that clearly evolved through specific cultures, specific time periods, and specific political needs. And even if you point out that morality has continuously changed over time, often improving as societies learned more, became more empathetic, and discovered better ways to organize themselves, they'll still insist that morality has always been static, which simply isn't true. If morality were truly fixed, slavery would still be normal, women would still be property, and countless basic human rights would never have emerged. In reality, moral progress has been driven by people thinking critically, questioning inherited norms, and expanding their understanding of fairness and well-being. But many people don't think about morality in terms of outcomes. They think about it in terms of obedience. And when someone is taught that obedience is what makes something good, they stop evaluating whether an action actually reduces harm or increases human flourishing. That's why these conversations feel so circular sometimes. You're analyzing the real-world impact of moral choices while they're analyzing whether a rule was broken. It's two different languages trying to describe the same event. Another argument that fits neatly into this tier is when someone says with complete seriousness that everyone secretly believes what they believe. It's a strange claim because it tries to rewrite your own thoughts in front of you. They'll say things like, deep down, you know it's true, as if you're just pretending otherwise. This happens because their worldview relies on the idea that doubt is impossible. If someone can live a thoughtful, compassionate, meaningful life without their belief system, it introduces a crack in the foundation. So instead of dealing with that possibility, they decide that you must be lying to yourself. It's easier to assume you're confused than to reconsider a belief that has been presented as absolute. And then there's the version of this argument where they try to explain your own motivations to you. They'll say things like, you just want to avoid accountability, or you just want to live however you want, even though most people who question religion do it because they care about what's true, not because they're trying to dodge responsibility. It's odd how many people assume that morality collapses the second their particular rules disappear. In reality, most people act morally because empathy, consequences, and cooperation matter for survival and well-being, not because they're afraid of being punished after death. But the next tier is where the arguments get more dramatic. These are the lines people throw out when they feel cornered, when they sense they're running out of talking points. The first one that usually appears is the classic threat of consequences, not logical consequences, but eternal ones. It's usually delivered in a soft voice, or sometimes with a hint of fear, as if they're trying to rescue you from something they imagine is coming. They'll tell you that disbelief has a price, even though they can't demonstrate any of it. But here's the interesting part. Almost nobody uses that argument because they've carefully considered it. It's usually an emotional reaction, a way to regain control in a conversation that's slipping away. If you ask them why a compassionate creator would design a universe where curiosity is punished, they don't have an answer. If you ask for evidence, the conversation pivots again. If you ask why an eternal punishment would be necessary for temporary human mistakes, the subject changes completely. The deeper you go, the more you realize that these arguments aren't built on logic. They're built on fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of being wrong, fear of confronting a reality where responsibility falls entirely on human shoulders. And the more those fears grow, the more people reach for shortcuts, arguments that sound firm but collapse instantly if you look closely. There's also the argument where someone insists that the complexities of the universe couldn't exist without a designer. They'll say something is too perfect, even though we live in a universe where chaos, randomness, and natural processes shape everything. They forget that complexity doesn't require intention. It requires time, variation, and the gradual accumulation of changes. But when someone is raised to see intentional design everywhere, they start connecting dots that aren't actually connected. They interpret every pattern as deliberate, every coincidence as guided, and every unknown as a sign of purpose. Once that habit forms, it becomes very difficult to break because it feels intuitive. It feels comfortable. It gives the illusion of understanding, even when it explains nothing. And that's why these conversations can go on for hours. Because the real disagreement isn't about facts. It's about the lens people use to interpret the world.